I swiped the call away without looking, letting my father's name vanish into the dark glass of my phone. Across my glass-walled dealership office, my 16-year-old daughter, Emma, sat on the leather couch, watching me with a cold, quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any argument. "He's called 3 times this week, Dad," she said, her voice entirely flat. "Are you really that busy, or are you just embarrassed of him?" I adjusted the cuff of my tailored jacket, keeping my eyes fixed on the sales projections in front of me. "I have a business to run, Emma." "Your grandfather lives at a different speed. He doesn't understand what my days are like. He doesn't live at a different speed," Emma replied softly, standing up and pulling her jacket around herself. "He lives 40 minutes away, in the same small house you spent your whole life pretending you didn't grow up in." She didn't slam the door when she left. She simply left it open enough for the distant laughter of my sales team to drift into the silence. I picked up my pen, telling myself that success required sacrifices, that my father would understand, that I'd call him back tomorrow. But as I stared at the dark screen, a sharp, suffocating discomfort began to settle in my chest. I set the pen down on the polished mahogany desk. The click of the heavy brass cap sounded louder than it should have in the quiet office. Outside my floor-to-ceiling glass wall, the showroom floor of Brooks Fine Automobiles was humming, with the quiet, expensive energy I had spent 15 years building. A brand-new sports coupe sat beneath the soft track lights, its metallic charcoal paint gleaming like liquid silk. 2 of my senior salesmen were walking a couple toward the finance office, nodding with the calibrated, smooth confidence I had personally trained into them. Everything in that room spoke of order, status, and control. Everything in that room was designed to tell the world that Daniel Brooks was a man who had made it. I stood up, walked over to the door, and pushed it closed, cutting off the low murmur of laughter from the floor. But closing the door didn't get rid of the air Emma had left behind. 40 minutes away, she had said. I walked to the window and looked down into the parking lot. I watched Emma cross the asphalt toward her sedan, a safe, sensible 3-year-old hatchback I had bought her for her 16th birthday. She didn't look back up at my window. She just got into the car, backed out of the space, and pulled out onto the main boulevard. I picked up my phone again. The screen woke up, showing the missed call notification. "Dad." Below it was a voicemail notification left 2 days ago that I hadn't listened to because I was in the middle of closing a $60,000 lease with a local surgeon. I unlocked the phone, raised it to my ear, and hit play. My father's voice came through the small speaker, gravelly and slow, carrying that faint, unmistakable rasp of a man who had spent 40 years breathing in sawdust, cold garage drafts, and cheap tobacco. "Hey, Dan. It's your dad. No rush on this, son. Just wanted to see how you were doing. Emma said you had that big regional inventory sale coming up, so I know you're up to your neck in work. Just had a little time this afternoon and thought maybe if you were driving past Oak Ridge this weekend, you might pull over for 20 minutes. We could sit on the back porch. I got some fresh peaches from Miller's Orchard. Anyway, hope the business is good. Love you, Dan. Talk to you when you get a breath." The message ended with the quiet beep of the system. I stood there holding the phone against my ear for a few seconds after the line went dead. It was always like that. He never sounded angry. He never demanded anything. He never called to complain about his knees or the fact that his small, oil-stained gravel driveway was washed out again after the spring rains. He spoke as if my time was made of fine china and his was just dirt, something cheap to be swept aside whenever I needed room. And for years, I had let him. I tucked the phone into my breast pocket, straightened my tie in the reflection of the glass, and opened the door back up. "Greg," I called out to my sales manager, "bring me the final figures on the quarter inventory before you leave tonight." "You got it, Mr. Brooks," Greg said, not even looking up from his tablet. I went back to my desk, opened the ledger, and forced myself to work until 8 o'clock. When I got home that evening, the house was dark, except for the warm yellow rectangle of light spilling from the kitchen. We lived in a sprawling, modern stone and timber home in Northridge. an upscale subdivision tucked against the hills 20 miles outside the city center. It had high ceilings, heated floors, and a double-sided fireplace that turned on with a remote control. When I first bought the land 10 years ago, right after my wife passed away from cancer, I told myself I was building a fortress for Emma and me, a place where nothing cheap or broken could ever touch us. I walked into the kitchen and set my briefcase on the island. Emma was sitting at the counter, a high school history textbook open in front of her, a half-eaten bowl of cereal melting beside her notebook. She didn't look up when the garage door clicked shut. She didn't look up when I pulled off my coat and hung it over the back of a bar stool. "Did you eat?" I asked softly. "I made a sandwich," she said without raising her eyes from the printed page. I moved toward the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, and twisted the cap open. The sound was sharp in the quiet kitchen. "Emma, about earlier at the office." "I don't want to talk about it, Dad," she interrupted calmly. She flipped a page in her book. The paper made a dry, crisp slide against the granite. "We need to talk about it," I said, leaning against the counter opposite her. "You can't come into my place of business and make comments like that in front of my staff. I've worked 20 years to build a reputation." "A reputation for what?" She finally looked up. Her green eyes, so much like her mother's, were steady, but there was a hard, guarded edge behind them that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "For having nice cars? For wearing $300 shoes? For being a professional?" I said, my voice tightening despite my efforts to keep it even. "For making sure you have a roof over your head, a safe car to drive, and tuition set aside for whatever college you choose. I didn't have those things when I was 16, Emma. I had a bedroom that didn't hold heat in November, and a father who smelled like exhaust fumes every time he came to a school play." The words came out before I could filter them. They were old words, rehearsed in my head for decades every time I thought about my youth. Emma stared at me for a long moment. Then she slowly closed her textbook, stacked her notebook neatly on top of it, and stood up. "Grandpa worked 6 days a week at the foundry and spent his Sundays fixing cars in the driveway so people in town could afford to drive to work," she said, her voice terrifyingly quiet for a girl her age. "He paid off his house. He 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 paid off his house. 10 years ago. Do you think I don't remember that?" A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "Emma, you think because he wears work boots from Sears and lives in a house with linoleum floors that he's less than you," she continued, her eyes glistening now, though she refused to let a tear drop. "You're not ashamed of his life, Dad. You're ashamed that you came from it. And every time he calls you, it reminds you that you're just a kid from Oak Ridge who put on an expensive suit." She picked up her books, walked past me without brushing my arm, and headed down the hallway toward her bedroom. A moment later, her door clicked shut. Not slammed, just clicked. I stood alone in the dark kitchen, the cold bottle of water heavy in my hand. The truth was a heavy, suffocating thing, and I had spent my entire adult life running from it. I was born in Oak Ridge, a small, weary town, built around a gravel quarry and an old iron foundry that had closed half its operations by the time I was 10. My father, Robert Brooks, was the kind of man who belonged to the earth. He was broad-shouldered, quiet, and carried a permanent gray shadow of grease beneath his fingernails, no matter how hard he scrubbed with pumice soap at the kitchen sink. When I was a boy, I thought my father was the strongest man in the world. He could lift the corner of an engine block with his bare hands. He could listen to the faint tick of a carburetor and tell you exactly which needle was out of alignment. But as I grew older, my eyes changed. By the time I hit high school, Oak Ridge felt like a trap, and my father felt like the anchor keeping me pinned to the bottom. I saw the parents of the kids who lived up on the ridge, the doctors, the real estate developers, the men who drove clean, quiet sedans with smooth leather seats and went to golf courses on Saturday mornings. They didn't have grease under their nails. Their coats didn't smell like old oil and stale coffee. When my high school baseball team made the regional finals, my father showed up straight from his shift at the foundry. He was wearing his heavy canvas work jacket, with the red wool lining frayed at the collar, his work boots caked in red clay. He sat in the third row of the bleachers, sitting alone, because nobody wanted to sit next to the smell of hot iron and sweat. I was standing in the dugout, wearing my clean white uniform, and when my teammates looked over and asked who the old guy in the work boots was, I looked away. "Just a guy from town," I said. I had said it quietly, but I had said it. And that night, when we drove home in his 1984 pickup, a truck that shook violently whenever it went over 40 miles an hour, my father hadn't said a word about it. He just handed me a brown paper bag with a cold bottle of root beer inside and said, "Good game today, Dan. You threw hard." After high school, I didn't go to college right away. I got a job at a local dealership 20 miles north. I learned how to talk. I learned how to smile without showing my teeth. I learned that if you wore a sharp shirt and kept your hair combed, people would give you money and respect. I worked 80 hours a week. I moved up from salesman to floor manager, then to general manager, and eventually, through sheer ruthless persistence, I bought out the principal owner of Brooks Fine Automobiles. With every step up the ladder, Oak Ridge shrank in my rearview mirror. My father never complained. When I moved into my first nice apartment, he came over with a toolbox and helped me hang curtains, keeping his boots off the carpet by taking them off at the front door and walking around in his thick woolen socks. When I married Sarah, he sat in the back row of the church, wearing a dark navy suit that was 10 years out of style and slightly tight across his wide shoulders. He cried quietly during the vows, dabbing his eyes with a folded handkerchief he kept in his pocket. And when Sarah died 6 years later, leaving me alone with a terrified 10-year-old Emma, Robert was there every single afternoon. He drove his rusty truck up to our neighborhood, parking it down the block so the neighbors wouldn't stare, and sat on our back porch, waiting for Emma's school bus to arrive. He made her grilled cheese sandwiches on white bread, taught her how to whittle small wooden birds out of fallen pine branches, and sat with her until I got home from the dealership at 8 or 9 at night. He had saved us. But as the years passed and the grief began to scab over, my old habits returned. I looked at the old truck parked in my driveway and felt that same familiar, sickening twist in my stomach. I stopped inviting him to dinner parties. I started telling him I was out of town on business when he asked if I wanted to drop by for a Sunday roast. Slowly, deliberately, I turned my own father into a ghost. By Friday, the silence in my house had become unbearable. Emma barely spoke to me. She made her own breakfast, walked to school, and left her dinner plates washed and drying by the sink before I even returned from work. It wasn't the fiery defiance of a teenager. It was the quiet, methodical withdrawal of someone who had decided I was no longer worth trying to reach. On Saturday morning, I woke up at 6. The house was dead quiet. I stood in the kitchen, watching the coffee maker drip into the glass carafe. My phone sat on the marble island next to my car keys. 40 minutes. It was only a 40-minute drive down Highway 9. I picked up the phone, unlocked it, and pulled up my father's contact. My thumb hovered over the green button. I could just drive down there. I could pull up to the small wood-frame house on Cedar Street, sit on the porch, eat a peach, and let him show me the garden he had been talking about for 3 years. Then my phone vibrated in my palm, making me jump. It was Greg from the dealership. "Mr. Brooks, sorry to call you so early on a Saturday," Greg said, his voice clipped and urgent. "The regional VP for the European line just flew in unannounced. He's at the showroom now. He wants to review our Q3 allocation numbers before he heads to the airport at noon." I looked out the kitchen window. The morning sun was just breaking over the trees, painting the lawn in long, golden strokes. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I heard myself say. I hung up, poured my coffee into a travel mug, scribbled a quick note for Emma on a sticky pad. In at work, for a few hours, back by lunch, and left the house. I told myself it was business. I told myself that maintaining our commercial allocation meant another $200,000 in revenue this year. I told myself that a man in my position couldn't just walk away from an executive meeting because he felt a sudden wave of sentimentality. I convinced myself that Oak Ridge would still be there tomorrow. The meeting ran long. The regional VP was a precise, cold man named Holloway who spent 3 hours picking apart our secondary margins and questioning our trade-in valuations. By the time he finally gathered his leather portfolio and shook my hand in the lobby, it was 2:10 in the afternoon. My head was pounding. I walked back into my office, pulled off my jacket, and tossed it over the back of my chair. My phone was sitting on the desk, vibrating silently on the wood. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, a local area code from the county south of us, Oak Ridge Regional Health. I stared at the screen for 2 full seconds before picking it up. My hand was suddenly cold. "Daniel Brooks?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded tired, the background noise of a busy nurse's station humming behind her words. "Yes, this is Daniel. Mr. Brooks, I'm calling from the emergency care unit at Oak Ridge Community Hospital. We have a patient here named Robert Brooks." The air seemed to leave the room all at once. "Is he... What happened? Did he fall?" "He was brought in by ambulance about an hour ago," the nurse said, her tone dropping into that measured, careful cadence that medical staff use when they are delivering bad news. "A neighbor found him sitting in his yard. He experienced a severe cardiovascular event. Mr. Brooks, his condition is critical." "Critical?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and high, like a child's. I can be there in 30 minutes. "Is he conscious?" "He's being stabilized in the ICU right now," she said. "If you can get here, you should come immediately." "I'm on my way," I said, already grabbing my jacket and keys. "I'm coming right now." I ran out through the showroom floor. Greg called out my name as I passed the reception desk, asking about a contract, but I didn't even turn my head. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, ran into the bright, blinding sunlight, and got into my car. My hands were shaking so violently, I had trouble inserting the keyless start button. When the engine roared to life, I backed out of the space so hard the tires chirped against the concrete. I dialed Emma's phone on the hands-free system as I pulled onto the highway. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Dad?" "Emma," I gasped, my voice cracking. "Where are you?" "I'm at the library." "What's wrong?" "It's your grandfather," I said, pressing the accelerator down until the needle hit 80. He's at Oak Ridge Hospital. He had a heart attack. A neighbor found him." There was a sudden, terrible silence on the line. Then I heard the sharp, wet sound of her breath catching in her throat. "Is he alive?" she whispered. "They're stabilizing him," I lied, trying to convince myself as much as her. "I'm on Highway 9 now. Do you want me to turn back and pick you up?" "No," she said instantly. Her voice had gone rigid with a terrified, cold discipline. "I'm 10 minutes closer than you. I'm taking my car. I'll meet you there." The line went dead. I pushed the car faster, weaving through the Saturday afternoon traffic. The long, manicured suburbs gave way to rural 2-lane roads. The pine trees grew denser, the gas stations smaller and older, their rusted signboards advertising bait and cheap coffee. Every mile felt like a confession. 40 minutes. I had spent 5 years pretending this drive was an impossible journey, an exhausting chore that required planning and effort. Now, as the trees blurred past my window, I realized how horrifyingly short 40 minutes actually was. It was nothing. It was the length of a single conference call. It was the time I spent every morning sitting in traffic on my way to a glass showroom. I pulled into the parking lot of Oak Ridge Community Hospital at 20 minutes to 3. The building was old, a squat, 2-story brick structure, built in the 1970s, with yellowing windows and a cracked asphalt driveway. I slammed my car into park, jumped out, and ran through the sliding glass doors into the lobby. Emma was already there. She was standing at the admittance desk, her small frame rigid, her face pale as linen. "Mr. Brooks?" A doctor in blue scrubs stepped through a set of double doors before I could reach the counter. He had graying hair, worn clogs, and eyes that held no optimism at all. "I'm Daniel Brooks," I said, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is my daughter, Emma. How is he? Where is my father?" The doctor looked at me, then at Emma, and offered a faint, heavy nod toward a quiet consultation room off the main hallway. "Let's sit down for a moment." "No," I said, stepping closer to him, my fists clenching at my sides. "No sitting down. Where is he? Can I see him?" "Mr. Brooks," the doctor said softly, placing a heavy, warm hand on my forearm. "Your father's heart suffered massive damage before the paramedics arrived. He went into cardiac arrest twice in the ambulance. We worked on him for nearly 45 minutes in resuscitation." He paused, letting the silence fill the space between us. "We were able to restore a faint rhythm, but his system is failing," he said softly. "He is on full life support in room 108. He hasn't regained consciousness." Emma made a small, broken sound and covered her mouth with both hands. I felt the floor beneath my polished shoes tilt. Is he going to wake up?" The doctor looked away for a fraction of a second, a tiny gesture that told me everything I didn't want to know. "His brain was without oxygen for too long, Daniel," he said, using my first name with a quiet, devastating familiarity. "His body is very weak. We are keeping him comfortable. If there are things you need to say to him, you should go in now." Room 108 smelled of rubbing alcohol, plastic tubing, and the sharp metallic tang of industrial floor cleaner. The rhythm of the heart monitor was slow, hollow, and unnatural. A synthetic, mechanical beep that filled the small room like a ticking clock in an empty house. My father lay in the center of the narrow bed under a thin, white hospital blanket. He looked tiny. That was the first thing that struck me. A thought so sudden and violent, it made me stumble against the doorframe. The man who used to lift engine blocks. The man whose shoulders had seemed broad enough to block out the sun when I was 5 years old, looked small and frail against the stiff white sheets. His skin had a translucent, waxy pale hue, and his large, calloused hands lay limp on top of the blanket, bruised from the IV needles taped to his wrists. A clear plastic mask covered his nose and mouth, fogging over with every slow, forced breath from the ventilator. "Dad," I whispered. I stepped into the room, my legs feeling heavy, as if I were walking through deep water. Emma walked past me, falling to her knees beside the bed. She took his right hand in both of hers, burying her face into his knuckles, her shoulders shaking with silent, rhythmic sobs. "Grandpa," she wept into his skin. "Grandpa, I'm here. Please, I'm here." My father didn't move. His eyelids remained closed, blue-veined and still. The monitor kept up its dull, artificial steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. I walked to the other side of the bed and sat down on the hard plastic chair. I reached out and touched his arm. His skin was cool, colder than it had ever been when he came home from the foundry on winter afternoons. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a rasp. "It's Dan. I'm here." He didn't respond. I looked at his face, at the deep familiar lines etched around his eyes and mouth, lines carved by 71 years of hard work, cold mornings, and quiet endurance. I looked at his hair, entirely white now, combed back neatly by a nurse who didn't know him. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The words felt pathetic. They felt small, useless, and heavy, dropping into the air between the mechanical hum of the ventilator and the flat, cold wall of the hospital room. "I'm sorry." For 5 years, I had held those words back because of my pride. I had saved them for a rainy day, for a time when I wasn't so busy, for an afternoon when I felt comfortable enough to drive 40 minutes south and sit on a wooden porch. I had traded my father's final conscious hours for inventory numbers, sales margins, and high-end sedans. And now, he was lying here, unable to hear them. The attending physician stepped quietly into the room about an hour later. He checked the monitors, adjusted the drip on the IV tree, and stood by the foot of the bed. "He's not in any pain, Daniel," he said softly. "The medication is keeping him resting." "Will he wake up?" I asked, looking up at him from the chair. My eyes were burning, even for a second, just to see us. The doctor looked down at his clipboard, then back at me with honest, painful compassion. I don't think so, son. His heart is doing less than 10% of the work. The machine is doing the rest. He left us alone again. As the afternoon light faded into the gray twilight of late autumn, the room grew darker. Emma eventually cried herself into a quiet, numb exhaustion, resting her head against the side of the mattress, her hand never letting go of her grandfather's fingers. A social worker came in around 7 o'clock with a small clipboard. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, leaning down beside me, "we need to get some preliminary paperwork taken care of. Personal items, medical history, and we need to know if your father had a designated power of attorney or a healthcare proxy in place." I rubbed my face with both hands. I don't know. He never talked about it. There might be documents at his home, she suggested gently. A house key, insurance papers, a living will. If someone could go by the house and check his desk or filing cabinet, it would help us make sure we honor his wishes. Emma raised her head from the bed, her eyes red and swollen. "I'll stay with him," she whispered. "Don't leave him alone, Dad, but I'll stay right here." I looked at my father's quiet face under the plastic mask. "I'll go," I said, my voice thick. "I'll get the key from his pocket and go to the house." The key ring in my hand was old and heavy. It had 3 brass keys and a faded green plastic tag with his name written in his own square, careful handwriting. R. Brooks. I drove down Cedar Street in the dark. The street hadn't changed in 30 years. The streetlights were still the old, yellowing sodium lamps that cast long amber shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Small, single-story frame houses sat back from the road, their porches dark, their yards cluttered with wood piles, old lawnmowers, and children's bicycles. I pulled my luxury SUV into the gravel driveway of my childhood home. The house was dark. The porch light was off. The small garden patch by the side of the front steps, the one he had mentioned in his voicemails, was neatly weeded, the green stalks of tomato plants tied carefully to wooden stakes with bits of old cotton rag. I got out of the car. The gravel crunched under my leather soles, a sound that echoed straight back into my childhood. I walked up the 3 wooden steps to the front porch. The screen door squeaked when I pulled it open, the exact same high-pitched hinge squeal I had heard every afternoon when I ran home from the bus stop 30 years ago. He had never oiled it. I inserted the key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the front door open. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the sterile, citrus-scented air of my house in Northridge. It was the smell of Cedar Street, old pine wood, dried coffee grounds, a faint hint of peppermint tea, and that quiet, permanent dust that settles into houses that have been lived in by the same person for 50 years. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unable to move, my hand resting on the wooden frame. I reached out and flipped the light switch. The small living room came into view under the soft glow of a fabric-shaded floor lamp. The sofa was the same brown floral print couch my mother had bought at a Sears outlet in 1988. The fabric was worn smooth on the armrests, where my father had sat every evening after work, reading the evening paper. On the small end table beside it sat his reading glasses, an unlit wooden pipe, and a half-empty mug of cold tea. He had left this room earlier today, thinking he was coming back. I stepped deeper into the house, my heart beating in my throat. On the mantelpiece above the small brick fireplace sat 6 framed photographs. I walked over and looked at them. There were no pictures of luxury cars or grand homes. There was a black and white photo of my mother on our wedding day. There was a photo of me when I was 7, holding up a small bass I had caught in the local pond, my face covered in mud. There was a picture of Emma when she was 5, sitting on his shoulders in this very living room, both of them laughing until their eyes were squints. And right in the center, in a gold-painted frame that looked like it had been bought at a local pharmacy, was a clipped article from the county newspaper from 8 years ago. It was a small 3-paragraph business announcement with a tiny, blurry photo of me standing in front of my dealership on the day I bought it. The headline read, "Local Native Opens Premier Auto Showroom." The paper was yellowed at the edges. My father had cut it out with scissors, mounted it onto a piece of black construction paper, and framed it. I stood in front of the mantelpiece, staring at that small yellowed piece of newsprint, and felt a cold tear spill over my cheek. He hadn't been angry that I left. He hadn't been bitter that I moved to Northridge. He had been proud of me. Oh God, I choked out into the empty room. I turned away from the mantelpiece and walked down the short, narrow hallway toward his small study at the back of the house, the room where he kept his desk and filing cabinet. The study was small, barely larger than a closet, with a single window overlooking the back garden, a heavy wooden desk, one he had built himself out of reclaimed barn timber, sat against the wall. On top of it was an old metal desk lamp with a green shade, a box of paper clips, and a small wooden tray holding his spare keys and a pair of reading glasses. I sat down in his wooden swivel chair. It creaked beneath my weight, the same familiar creak I used to hear through the walls when he sat up late doing the household bills. I pulled open the top drawer looking for the medical files or insurance papers the hospital had asked for. Inside was a single blue folder labeled Important Docs. I pulled it out. Inside was his life insurance policy, the deed to the house, and a small handwritten note taped to the front. In case of emergency, contact my son, Daniel Brooks. Below it was my dealership office number and my cell phone number, written in thick, black marker so he wouldn't miss a digit. I set the folder on the desk, feeling a heavy, crushing ache in my ribs. I reached down to close the drawer, but as I pulled it, I noticed a large wooden chest sitting underneath the desk, tucked back into the knee hole where his feet would rest. It was an old cedar box, about 2 feet wide, with iron brass handles on the sides. It didn't have a lock. I dropped to my knees on the cold wood floor, leaned under the desk, and pulled the heavy box out into the middle of the small room. The lid was smooth, darkened by years of furniture wax. On top of the lid, carved directly into the cedar wood in crude, jagged block letters, were the initials, DB, my initials. I sat back on my heels, my hands resting on the cool wood of the chest. I hesitated for several seconds, my breath rattling in my chest, afraid of what I was about to open. Then I lifted the brass latch and raised the heavy lid. The sharp, clean scent of cedar burst into the room, mixed with the dry, fragile smell of old paper. Inside, stacked in neat, precise, chronological piles held together with rubber bands and yellowed twine, were hundreds of sheets of paper. I reached down with shaking hands and picked up the first stack from the top. It was a piece of cheap construction paper, faded around the edges from 35 years of darkness. On it was a crude drawing made in bright red and blue crayon, a drawing of a giant boxy truck with wheels that weren't quite round and a stick-figure man sitting behind the wheel. At the bottom, in messy, oversized kindergarten handwriting, was my name, Daniel. My finger brushed against the crayon wax. I picked up the next sheet beneath it. It was a drawing from 2nd grade, a hand-drawn birthday card, made on lined notebook paper. To the best dad in the world, happy birthday. Love, Dan. Inside was a drawing of 2 people standing side by side in a green field, holding hands under a yellow sun. I set that stack aside and reached deeper into the chest. There were drawings from 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, blueprints of futuristic sports cars I had drawn on graph paper when I was 10, complete with little notes in the margins describing how fast they could go. Pencil sketches of houses with 3 garages. Watercolor paintings of mountains that I had done in art class and brought home in my backpack. Every single piece of paper I had ever handed him as a child was in that box. He hadn't thrown a single one away. Not one. When I brought home a messy finger painting at 6 years old, he had taken it, praised it, and when I thought he put it away in a drawer, he had carefully preserved it in this cedar chest. I kept digging, my hands trembling violently now. Near the bottom of the box, tucked inside a clear plastic sleeve, was a paper placemat from a local diner in Oak Ridge. It was dated September 14th, 1996, the month I turned 12. On the back of the placemat, drawn in blue ballpoint pen during a Sunday breakfast after my mother took us out for pancakes, was a detailed sketch I had made of a massive automobile showroom. I had drawn high glass windows, polished floors, and a row of sports cars parked out front. Above the main entrance, written in shaky cursive, were the words, Brooks Motors. Below the drawing, written in my father's quiet, neat pencil script, were 3 lines. Danny drew this today at breakfast. He told me he's going to own a place like this when he grows up. I know he will. He's got the drive for it. God bless my boy. I held the paper placemat in both hands, staring down at those pencil lines written 30 years ago by a man who had worked 12-hour shifts at a foundry just to make sure I had food on the table and shoes without holes. The dam inside me finally broke. I collapsed forward against the wooden chest, burying my face into the stacks of faded paper, and sobbed. I didn't sob like a 42-year-old businessman in a $300 suit. I cried like the frightened, foolish child who had been so terrified of being poor that he had thrown away the only man who had ever loved him without condition. The room was completely quiet, except for my ragged, choking breaths and the dry rustle of 30 years of crayon and pencil paper beneath my forehead. All those years I had thought I was escaping Oak Ridge. I had thought I was rising above my father's humble, grease-stained life. I had convinced myself that my luxury cars, my stone house in Northridge, and my executive title were the measures of who I had become. But sitting on the cold floor of that dark study, surrounded by my father's silent devotion, I saw myself clearly, for the first time in my life. I wasn't a success. I was an arrogant, blind fool who had traded his father's unconditional love for the applause of strangers who wouldn't even remember my name 10 years from now. He hadn't wanted my money. He hadn't wanted me to buy him a new house or drive him around in expensive cars. He had just wanted 20 minutes on his back porch. He had just wanted his son to sit beside him, eat a peach, and talk to him. And I had been too busy. A footstep sounded in the hallway behind me. I turned my head, my face wet with tears, my breath still catching in my throat. Emma was standing in the doorway of the study. She was holding her car keys in one hand, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the autumn chill that was creeping into the unheated house. She looked down at me, at her father kneeling on the dusty floor in his ruined suit, surrounded by hundreds of childhood drawings. She didn't look angry anymore. Her face was soft, pale, and filled with a deep, sorrowful quiet. "I drove over to find you," she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "The hospital called my cell. They said his blood pressure is dropping." I stood up slowly, my knees cracking in the quiet room. My suit pants were covered in gray dust from the floor. I didn't try to wipe the tears from my eyes. I didn't try to fix my tie, or put on the polished, impenetrable face I had worn for 20 years. I just stood there, vulnerable and entirely broken before my daughter. "Emma," I choked out, stepping toward her. "Look at this." I held out the placemat, the drawing of the showroom with his handwritten note at the bottom. Emma walked into the room and took the fragile paper from my hand. She looked down at the blue ballpoint pen lines, her eyes reading the 3 pencil sentences at the bottom. A fresh tear trickled down her nose and splashed onto the paper, right next to my father's handwriting. "He kept everything, Dad," she whispered, looking into the open chest at the hundreds of drawings stacked inside. "He talked about you every time I came down here, every single time. He never let me leave without telling me how proud he was of what you built." I was so wrong, I sobbed, closing my eyes as the shame tore through me like a physical blade. I was so terribly wrong about everything, Emma. I thought I was protecting us. I thought I was making something of myself. Emma set the paper down on the desk. She stepped closer to me, raised her arms, and wrapped them tightly around my chest, resting her forehead against my lapel. I held her. I held my 16-year-old daughter in the middle of that small, dark study, clutching her, as if she were the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. "He knows you loved him, Dad," she whispered into my coat, though her own voice was shaking with grief. He knew, but we have to go back now. We have to go back right now. The drive back to the hospital felt like a dream. I didn't speed. I didn't weave through traffic. I held the steering wheel with both hands, my eyes fixed on the yellow lines, illuminating the dark highway. Emma sat in the passenger seat beside me, her hand resting on the center console, her fingers intertwined with mine. For the first time in years, there was no wall between us. The anger, the judgment, and the defensive pride had all been stripped away, leaving only the raw, shared pain of two people who loved the same dying man. When we stepped back into room 108, the atmospheric change was immediate. The synthetic rhythm of the heart monitor had slowed significantly. The numbers on the digital screen were flashing in soft yellow warnings. A nurse was standing by the bedside, her hand resting on the back of my father's chair, her face grave. "His pressure is 45/30, Mr. Brooks," she said gently. "His organs are shutting down. It won't be long now." I walked directly to the bed. I didn't care about the tubes. I didn't care about the plastic mask or the cold, sterile smell of the room. I reached down, took my father's heavy, calloused right hand in both of mine, and brought it to my face. His skin was rough against my cheek, the familiar, coarse texture of a man who had worked with iron and stone his entire life. "Dad," I said, leaning down so my mouth was inches from his ear. The monitor beeped once, slowly. "Dad, I found the box," I whispered, my tears falling onto his pale wrist. "I found the chest under your desk. I saw the placemat, Dad. I saw what you wrote." There was no movement from his face. His eyes remained closed under the soft fluorescent light. "I'm so sorry, Dad," I choked out, my voice breaking completely as I pressed my forehead against his hand. "I was so arrogant. I was so blind. You built everything good in me, and I spent 20 years pretending I did it alone. I'm so sorry I didn't come home." Beside me, Emma leaned over the bed, taking his other hand, kissing his knuckles over and over again. "We love you, Grandpa. We're both right here. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. We're right here." The heart monitor gave a long, slow tone. The numbers on the screen flickered, dropping down into the single digits. I tightened my grip on his hand, holding on with everything I had left in my body, as if the sheer weight of my grip could pull him back across the line. "Please, Dad," I whispered into the quiet room. "Just hear me. Please, just hear me." The monitor's rhythm stretched out, 5 seconds between beeps, then 8, then 10. His hand in mine felt heavy, quiet, and still. I sat there in the dim hospital light, holding my father's hand, staring at his calm, peaceful face, waiting for the final sound that would end his life, and knowing that the man I was when I walked into this hospital 4 hours ago was gone forever. The monitor went flat at 8:14 p.m. The long, unbroken tone vibrated through the small hospital room, filling the space until the nurse stepped forward and quietly switched off the machine. In that sudden, heavy stillness, the only sound left was the soft rustle of autumn rain tapping against the yellowing glass window. I didn't let go of his hand right away. I stayed seated in that hard plastic chair for a long time, holding those rough, calloused fingers against my cheek, feeling the last lingering warmth leave his skin. Beside me, Emma held his other hand, her silent tears soaking into the white cotton sheet. For 20 years, I had believed that death was something that happened far away, something that could be managed or postponed if you were wealthy enough, successful enough, or busy enough. But as I sat in the dim light of room 108, looking at my father's quiet face, I realized the ultimate truth about time. It doesn't care about your titles, your bank accounts, or the luxury cars sitting in your showroom. When it runs out, all that remains is the love you were willing to give, and the pride you were brave enough to let go. We held the funeral 2 days later at the small red-brick Baptist church at the end of Cedar Street in Oak Ridge. I didn't hire a catering company from Northridge. I didn't send out glossy, formal announcements to city executives or high-end clients. I kept it simple, exactly as he would have wanted. The small sanctuary was packed to the back row. They weren't men in tailored three-piece suits. They were retired foundry workers in ironed flannel shirts, local mechanics with oil-stained knuckles, and elderly neighbors who remembered my father clearing their driveways after snowstorms or dropping off fresh tomatoes from his garden. When it came time for the family to speak, I walked up the 3 wooden steps to the pulpit. My hands weren't shaking anymore, but my chest felt hollowed out, as if every ounce of my old, defensive pride had been scrubbed away. I looked out at those weathered, honest faces in the pews. Then I pulled a single sheet of paper out of my jacket pocket, the blue ballpoint drawing of the dealership on the diner placemat. My father spent his entire life doing hard, quiet work, I told them, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet church. He was a man who never asked for praise, never complained about his burdens, and never looked down on anyone. For a long time, I was so foolishly focused on building a life of material success that I forgot the most important lesson he ever taught me, that a man's worth is measured by how he treats the people who love him. I looked down at Emma sitting in the front row, her green eyes wet but steady, as she looked back up at me. My dad saved every drawing I ever made as a child, I continued, my breath hitching slightly. He kept them tucked away in a cedar box under his desk, like holy artifacts. He was proud of me, even when I was too arrogant to deserve it. I can't bring him back to tell him I'm sorry. But I can spend the rest of my life becoming the kind of man he believed I was when he held on to those papers. After the service, in the small church hall where the women's auxiliary had set out coffee and homemade biscuits, I stood beside Emma and greeted every single person who came through the line. When an old foundry worker named Joe stepped up to me, his hands broad, heavy, and stained gray at the knuckles, just like my father's, I didn't pull back. I reached out, took his hand in both of mine, and listened as he told me about the time my dad spent 4 hours in the cold fixing his radiator so he wouldn't miss a shift. "He loved you, Dan," the old man said, his eyes gleaming with tears. "He talked about you every single morning at the shop." "Thank you, Joe," I said, holding his rough hand tight. "Thank you for being his friend." On Monday morning, I drove into Brooks Fine Automobiles for the first time since my father's death. The showroom was gleaming under the bright track lights. The polished concrete floor was spotless, and the charcoal sports coupe sat beneath the ceiling lights like a piece of high-end sculpture. But as I walked through the double-glass doors, the whole place felt different, cold, quiet, and strangely hollow. Greg met me near the reception desk, a leather folder tucked under his arm, his face tight with professional concern. "Mr. Brooks," he said softly, walking beside me toward my office, "I'm so sorry for your loss. We kept things running while you were away, but we have a situation with the Q4 allocation targets. The regional director wants to know if we are participating in the midnight sales event this Friday. It means 70-hour weeks for the management team through the holidays, but it's the only way we'll secure the top regional award. 3 weeks ago, I would have signed the authorization without hesitation. I would have called a staff meeting, rallied the sales floor, and spent 90 hours a week behind my mahogany desk to ensure my name was at the top of the regional leaderboards. I stopped walking and looked around the showroom. I looked at the sleek glass walls, the high-end leather chairs, and the rows of pristine automobiles. Then I looked at Greg, who was waiting with his pen poised, ready for my order. "No," I said quietly. Greg blinked, surprised. "No, Mr. Brooks. If we pass on the midnight event, we drop to 3rd place in the district. We won't get the regional trophy. Let someone else have the trophy, Greg," I said. I reached over, took the folder from his hands, and set it down on the reception desk. "Starting this week, I want you to promote Marcus to assistant general manager, give him half my administrative duties, and adjust his salary accordingly. And I want the shift schedules revised, so no one on this floor works more than 40 hours a week." Greg stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. Are you stepping down? I'm stepping back, I replied, a small, genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in weeks. I have a business to run, but I no longer intend to let it run my life. I won't be in on Fridays anymore. I walked into my office, gathered my personal belongings from the desk, and packed them into my leather bag. I didn't look back at the glass walls as I walked out the door. I didn't sell the house on Cedar Street. Instead, every Friday afternoon after school, Emma and I drove down to Oak Ridge. Together, over the next 2 months, we repaired the small, aging frame house. We replaced the rotted boards on the back porch, painted the living room a warm cream color, and cleared out the overgrown weeds in the garden patch, planting fresh winter greens in the rich, dark soil my father had tended for 50 years. In the small study, I left his barn timber desk right where it was. The cedar chest sat beneath it, but its contents were no longer hidden away in the dark. Emma and I bought simple wooden frames from the local hardware store. Together, we framed dozens of the childhood drawings, the kindergarten trucks, the crayon birthday cards, the watercolor mountains, and the pencil blueprints. We hung them along the narrow hallway walls, creating a gallery of a father's quiet, unbroken devotion. And right beside the front door, placed where anyone entering the house would see it first, was the framed paper placemat from 1996, with my father's pencil writing visible at the bottom. God bless my boy. One Saturday afternoon in late November, the air was cold, sharp, and clear. The leaves had all fallen from the oak trees, carpeting the backyard in deep shades of gold and brown. I stepped out through the squeaky screen door onto the back porch, a door I had deliberately chosen not to oil, carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot apple cider. Emma was sitting on the top wooden step, her legs wrapped in a woolen blanket, looking out over the quiet garden. I walked over, handed her a mug, and sat down beside her, leaning my back against the weathered wooden post. The silence between us wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, comfortable, and easy. The kind of quiet that only exists between people who no longer have anything to hide from one another. He used to sit right here, didn't he? Emma asked softly, blowing gently on the steam rising from her cup. Every Sunday afternoon, I said, watching a blue jay land on the fence post at the edge of the yard. He'd sit right here, drink his tea, and listen to the ball game on a pocket radio. Emma turned her head and looked at me. The distant, guarded expression that had haunted her face for months was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, mature warmth. You look different here, Dad, she whispered. How so? You look like you're actually here, she said gently, resting her head against my shoulder. Not thinking about the dealership, not looking at your phone, just here. I wrapped my arm around her shoulder, pulling her close against the crisp afternoon chill, feeling the solid, living weight of my daughter beside me. I am here, sweetheart, I said, my voice thick with a deep, quiet gratitude. I'm right where I belong. We sat together on that wooden porch as the afternoon sun began to sink below the line of pine trees, painting the sky in long streaks of orange and purple. There were no executive meetings to attend, no sales reports to sign, and no titles left to prove. I had lost my father waiting for a visit I was too proud to make, but standing in the quiet aftermath of that grief, I had finally found my way back home. Many of us spend our lives chasing achievements, titles, and material success, convincing ourselves that we are building a legacy for the people we love. But as this story reminds us, the most precious thing we can give our family isn't financial security or social status. It is simply our presence. Pride can persuade us that there will always be another weekend, another month, or another year to make that drive and sit on that porch, but time is never guaranteed. Have you ever let pride or busyness create distance between you and someone who loved you unconditionally? How did you find your way back? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. I would love to read your stories. Success means nothing when you lose the people who loved you when you had nothing at all.